Okay, we're recording. Over to you. Thank you.
So, hello. For everyone who doesn't know me, I'm Lucy Aubrey. I'm in year 12, and as anyone who knows me will tell you, have kind of a mild obsession with any TV show or movie that I've been watching, particularly ones with queer characters and storylines. And I'm going to share that. So I just want to say a few things before I start. There is so much of this that I would love to be able, and I just can't cover all of it. So I'm mainly going to look at gay and lesbian representation, just because that's what I know best. And it will be from a largely English-speaking perspective, mainly focused around the US. Next slide, please. So can you mute your mic, please?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I thought I'd done that.
So in the early 20th century was the first time film really started to be happening. And there was small appearances from queer characters in the early 20th century in silent films, but they were normally played as a comic relief side character. So, for example, that is a picture of Charlie Chaplin in drag in a film called The Woman. And then in 1934, a thing came in, which was called the Major Motion Picture Production Code. And this is commonly known as the Hays Code. And that's named after Will Hays, who was the director of the board of distributors who made it. And what this was industry guidelines for any movie that was going to be released on a large scale in the USA. And it said what you could and couldn't show. And this included things like firearms and arson, excessive gore and drug use and depictions of childbirth. But it also had an incredibly Christian focus. So there were banning of blasphemy. So you couldn't say, oh God, or oh Christ. And the other thing it banned of particular for this was sexual perversion. And gay characters fell under that. And it didn't ban them completely. They could be shown, but if they were, they had to be shown in a negative manner. So that normally meant the character would die at the end. And we still see repercussions of this in very recent years with the trope of burial gays, where gay characters, particularly lesbians, which is why it's also known as dead lesbian syndrome, are often the first people to die in a TV show. And there have been many prolific cases of this in the past few years. There was still representation coming out of Europe. So the picture I've got at the top is a film from the 1930s from France. And then into the 1950s and 60s, more queer characters and stories were starting to appear. They were still very much side characters. It was never very blatant and was referred to in innuendos. So one of my favorites from the time was interior designer was a shorthand for a gay man, or they were cut from the movie entirely. And this was because Hays Code was beginning to not be used as much and it wasn't really enforced. But then into the middle half of the 20th century, there were two big changes that happened nearly simultaneously. Have the next slide, please. So this was the overturn of Hays Code in 1968. So after it had been fading away from years, it was completely abolished then. And it was replaced by the MPAA rating system that is still used in America to rate films. That's things like the U and PG-13 ratings. And there was the gay liberation movement culminating with the Stonewall riots in 1969. And what that meant was industries started seeing gay people as a potential consumer and a new demographic. So there started to be more movies that were for that audience, particularly in the making of Broadway shows into films. So I've got the examples of Cabaret and the Rocky Horror Picture Show that were really popular Broadway musicals that were then made into films around this time. Into the 70s and into the 80s was the first time gay characters and gay stories started to appear on TV. So it was mainly in sitcoms, and it was kind of in a very special episode format. So these characters would show up for one episode and that would kind of be it. and they were almost treated like the crisis of the week or the problem that has to be solved. And it was much less about the queer character and more about the straight character's reaction to them and how they were coping with it. So there was an episode of MASH, Golden Girls, I think one of them had a gay brother. Cheers, the bar in Cheers nearly became a gay bar for an episode. And one of the other really important things that fictional queer people in the media has done was, next slide, played a massive role in US marriage equality. So this is often considered as the fastest social change of the last century. And you can see on that graph how opinions changed and how it was quite steady for a long time and then got kind of rapidly changed. So this was due to lots of factors. People were often suing their states, saying that not having marriage equality was unconstitutional. And Massachusetts had legalized same-sex marriage very, very early on. But visibility was a major factor. And this came in lots of different ways. It was a big news story at the time. And the way political and campaign ads were ran was they stopped being about this political idea of marriage when nobody really cared. They started being about real people and real human stories. And people started to see that gay people didn't just want to get married for political reasons. And another big part of that visibility was the TV. So in 2012, The Hollywood Reporter did a poll and it found that 27% of likely voters said depictions of gay characters on TV had made them more pro-gay marriage. And the most cited part of this was Mitch and Cam from Modern Family, who then did go on and get married. And this has led to something. So there is a psychological theory called the parasocial contact hypothesis, where basically seeing stories on TV makes you more accepting of them. And because of this, it has been nicknamed the Modern Family phenomenon, or the Modern Family effect. And a lot of the information from the last few slides, I just want to say, is from a journalist and YouTuber called Matt Baum. He is incredibly funny, incredibly informative, and does a lot of what I've kind of been doing. So if you've been interested, definitely look into this. So while I was putting this together, I really wanted to talk about how important these types of stories had been for me and why I love them so much. And next slide, please. This was my shortlist. These were all the characters who I absolutely loved and would have loved to talk about. But and I thought these were all my mainstream choices, but Miss Morgan could maybe name two of them. So maybe I started thinking my tastes were a bit more obscure than I thought. But putting these together, two things really stood out to me that I knew I wanted to talk about. The first being a character in particular, so Santana Lopez from Glee. So I know Glee is not a perfect show. There are so many issues with a lot of the things it deals with, not very well, but I watched all 6 seasons in the summer before I went into year 7. Miss, can I have the next slide, please? So I watched all 6 seasons the summer before year 7, and it was the first real, and I had seen it when it was originally coming out because I have a brother who's much older than me. And it was kind of the first representation I saw. So of course it made a big impact, but I think it went more than that. There were points where she was so unsure of her sexuality and what that was going to mean for her being a lesbian and what her life was going to look like. But even through those moments, she could still be so sure of herself. And I think as well, beyond that, she had this amazing way of being so strong and so tough, yet still was an incredibly vulnerable character. She cried more than anyone else on the show, which is a fun bit of Glee trivia for you. So the way she balanced that and did that with her sexuality as well, I really admired and I still think about. And the other thing that I realized I'd kind of known before, but it definitely cemented it when I was putting this list together, was how a lot of my favorite queer stories and queer characters are in, next slide please, Miss, are in kind of a sci-fi supernatural world. So I just have a few here. I've got Legends of Tomorrow. Those two girls just confess their love to each other while in Viking North America being attacked by a giant Furby doll, which I think kind of sets up the kind of TV show I watch for you very well. But I think it works so well because in a story like that, the queerness and the sexuality is much less of a big deal. Because when you have a story of someone in high school, or they're going through that, they're coming out and dealing with their identity is going to probably be a really big factor. But when you're fighting zombies or trying to deal with vampires in your school, it's much less of a big deal, and there isn't time for that. I think this is really and well on Absolutely Remarkable Thing, for example. So the main character is basically this, is appointed as the leader to communicate with the aliens that have invaded, and she's in a same-sex relationship, and it is brought up that they are both girls, I think maybe once or twice, just because there's hundreds of pages of this action and these aliens and things. And again, this is brought up in Carmilla, which is that scene of the girl and the guy in the paper bag. So that's her dad. He in lots of ways reminds me of my dad, which I think is one of the reasons I love that show. But he says to this girl, like, I really want you to know I'm not against your girlfriend because she's a girl. I'm against her because she is a vampire. And I think that sums it up so well, that it just feels much more normal and much more of an everyday thing, which it is, against alien battles and zombies and all these type of things that are going on. I think another reason why queer science fiction is such a good medium is because the shows like this have such a knack for having a cult following and having really active subreddits and Tumblrs that really give you a sense of community and belonging in a group of people who love the same thing. And seeing all the jokes people make and the in-jokes that get formed around the shows, I think is one of the best and one of the funniest things about loving a TV show. So that's my talk. I think I might have some time for questions, because I went quicker than I thought I did. But even so, if you'd like to talk to me about anything I've said or any shows you've seen that no one else in the world has watched, please come and say hi to me. My email address is about.
Thanks so much, Lucy. That was great. I don't know if it's that you chose obscure examples or if I'm just really old. I think it may be the latter.
Maybe
to be
both.
honest. Does anyone have any questions? I know this is a bit of a weird format for questions, but we'd love to hear them if you do have any.
I think that's going to be a no.
You, Maddie, just turn on the mic if you do.
Hello.
Hi, baby.
If you could improve something about the presentation of like queer people in fiction in the future, what would you change, or what would you say if I was a director, what would you say to me?
What don't you do?
Yeah.
I think it needs to be much more widespread. I feel like it should be at the point where I physically can't watch every show on Netflix that has a lesbian lead in, but it feels like at the minute I can and I do. I think also stories need to revolve much less around the coming out process. You see it a lot where that's a big part of the story, but that, yes, is a big part of the queer experience, but it really doesn't stop there. And there's very little representation post that. I think as well is something strange I've noticed is that so many coming out stories are when people, I can name one that goes against this rule, but it's when somebody is already in a relationship. And that does happen, but it's not as common as TV says it is. And I think there needs to be more of those stories as well.
Thank you. Great question and answer. Any other questions?
Hi, Lucy.
Hi.
I wondered if you've got a top queer fiction novel that you'd recommend?
Yes. So I had two on the PowerPoint. An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green is amazing. The sequel, I think, is even better. It's an incredible work. And again, it just sort of touches on it and moves past it. I love what's the book I read? There are some honestly great ones. We're the Ants by Sean David Hutchinson is I'm not much of a reader, but I completely devoured that book. It's about a boy whose boyfriend has just killed himself. His friends are all really struggling, and then he gets abducted by aliens, and they ask him, like, is your world worth saving? Like, you can save it right now. And it's about sort of humanity and what all that means, and it's amazing. It's great.
I'm going to buy those.
So good. They're so good. I have a spare copy of one of them. I'll send it in to you.
Have you come across Alice Oseman's books?
Yes.
Or Oseman?
It's on my list. I'm getting there.
I'm going to really recommend that you look at Loveless. Her latest one. It's just won a top prize, and it's really good. And it's a great insight into life at university as well as examining sexuality.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, well, I know you're going to carry on talking about these things with each other. I'm really glad to see you all here, and thank you again, Lucy. Really, really appreciate it. Next week, I don't have a talk scheduled, but I do for the following Wednesday at the same time. That's with Miss Nicholson, and she's going to be talking about different personality types, introversion, and things around neurodivergence. So please come along to that. Also, come up with some talks that you would like to do. I've got a free slot next week. If you've got something that you'd like to do, then please do come and let me know, and we'd love to host you. Thank you so much, Lucy. That was great. So lovely to see you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done.